Chapter 1. Mr. Lockwood visits Wuthering Heights.
1801. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, Mr. Heathcliff. I am delighted with the house I am renting from him. Thrushcross Grange is miles away from any town or village. That suits me perfectly. And the scenery here in Yorkshire is so beautiful. Mr. Heathcliff, in fact, is my only neighbour, and I think his character is similar to mine. He does not like people either. "My name is Lockwood," I said, when I met him at the gate to his house. "I'm renting Thrushcross Grange from you. I just wanted to come and introduce myself." He said nothing, but frowned, and did not encourage me to enter. After a while, however, he decided to invite me in. "Joseph, take Mr. Lockwood's horse," he called, "and bring up some wine from the cellar." Joseph was a very old servant, with a sour expression on his face. He looked crossly up at me as he took my horse. "God help us, a visitor," he muttered to himself. Perhaps there were no other servants, I thought, and it seemed that Mr. Heathcliff hardly ever received guests. His house is called Wuthering Heights. The name means a windswept house on a hill, and it is a very good description. The trees around the house do not grow straight, but are bent by the north wind, which blows over the moors every day of the year. Fortunately, the house is strongly built, and is not damaged even by the worst winter storms. The name Earnshaw is cut into a stone over the front door. Mr. Heathcliff and I entered the huge main room. It could have been any Yorkshire farmhouse kitchen, except that there was no sign of cooking, and no farmer sitting at the table. Mr. Heathcliff certainly does not look like a farmer. His hair and skin are dark, like a gypsy's, but he has the manners of a gentleman. He could perhaps take more care with his appearance, but he is handsome. I think he is proud, and also unhappy. We sat down by the fire in silence. "Joseph!" shouted Mr. Heathcliff. No answer came from the cellar, so he dived down there, leaving me alone with several rather fierce-looking dogs. Suddenly, one of them jumped angrily up at me, and in a moment all the others were attacking me. From every shadowy corner in the great room appeared a growling animal, ready to kill me, it seemed. "Help! Mr. Heathcliff, help!" I shouted, trying to keep the dogs back. My landlord and his servant were in no hurry to help, and could not have climbed the cellar steps more slowly. But luckily a woman, who I supposed was the housekeeper, rushed into the room to calm the dogs. "What the devil is the matter?" Mr. Heathcliff asked me rudely, when he finally entered the room. "Your dogs, sir," I replied. "You shouldn't leave a stranger with them. They're dangerous." Come, Mr. Lockwood. Have some wine. We don't often have strangers here, and I'm afraid neither I nor my dogs are used to receiving them." I could not feel offended after this, and accepted the wine. We sat drinking and talking together for a while. I suggested visiting him tomorrow. He did not seem eager to see me again, but I shall go anyway. I am interested in him, even if he isn't interested in me. 2 days later. Yesterday afternoon was misty and bitterly cold, but I walked the 4 miles to Wuthering Heights and arrived just as it was beginning to snow. I banged on the front door for 10 minutes, getting colder and colder. Finally, Joseph's head appeared at a window of one of the farm buildings. "What do you want?" he growled. "Could you let me in?" I asked desperately. He shook his head. "There's only Mrs. Heathcliff indoors, and she won't open the door to you." Just then a young man appeared and called me to follow him. We went through the back door and into the big room where I had been before. I was delighted to see a warm fire and a table full of food, and this time there was a woman sitting by the fire. She must be Mrs. Heathcliff, I thought. I had not imagined my landlord was married. She looked at me coldly, without saying anything. "Terrible weather," I remarked. There was silence. "What a beautiful animal!" I tried again, pointing to one of the dogs that had attacked me. She still said nothing, but got up to make the tea. She was only about 17, with the most beautiful little face I had ever seen. Her golden wavy hair fell around her shoulders. "Have you been invited to tea?" she asked me crossly. "No, but you are the proper person to invite me," I smiled. For some reason this really annoyed her. She stopped making the tea and threw herself angrily back in her chair. Meanwhile, the young man was staring aggressively at me. He looked like a farm worker, but seemed to be part of the family. I did not feel at all comfortable. At last, Heathcliff came in. "Here I am, sir, as I promised," I said cheerfully. "You shouldn't have come," he answered, shaking the snow off his clothes. "You'll never find your way back in the dark." "Perhaps you could lend me a servant to guide me back to the Grange?" I asked. "No, I couldn't. There aren't any servants here except Joseph and the housekeeper. Get the tea ready, will you?" he added fiercely to the young woman. I was shocked by his unpleasantness. We sat down to eat. I tried to make conversation with the 3 silent people round the table. "How happy you must be, Mr. Heathcliff," I began, "in this quiet place, with your wife and—" "My wife? My wife's ghost, you mean?" I suddenly realized I had made a serious mistake. So his wife was dead. Of course he was too old to be married to that young girl. She must be married to the young man next to me, who was drinking his tea out of a bowl and eating his bread with unwashed hands. Perhaps the poor girl had found no one better to marry in this uninhabited area. I turned politely to the young man. "Ah, so you are this lady's husband." This was worse than before. His face went red, and he seemed only just able to stop himself hitting me. He muttered something I could not hear. "Wrong again, Mr. Lockwood," said Mr. Heathcliff. "No, her husband, my son, is dead. This," he added, looking scornfully at the young man, "is certainly not my son. My name is Hareton Earnshaw," growled the young man. We finished our meal in silence, and when I looked out of the window, all I could see was darkness and snow. "I don't think I can get home without a guide," I said politely. No one answered me, I turned to the woman. "Mrs. Heathcliff," I begged, "what can I do? Please, help me." "Take the road you came on," she replied without interest, opening a book. "That's the best advice I can give." "Mr. Heathcliff, I'll have to stay here for the night," I told him. "I hope that will teach you not to walk over the moors in bad weather," he answered. "I don't keep guest bedrooms. You can share a bed with Hareton or Joseph." I was so angry with them all that I could not stay there a moment longer, and rushed out into the darkness. I saw Joseph by the back door, caught hold of the lamp he was carrying, and ran with it to the gate. But the dogs chased after me and attacked me, and I was soon knocked to the ground. Heathcliff and Hareton stood at the door, laughing, as I shouted at the dogs and tried to get up. In the end, I was again rescued by the housekeeper, Zillah, who ordered away the dogs and helped me to my feet. I was so bruised and exhausted that I did not feel strong enough to walk home. And although I did not want to, I had to spend the night at Wuthering Heights. Nobody wished me good night, as Zillah took me upstairs to find a bed for me.
Chapter 2. Catherine Earnshaw's Room.
1801. "Quietly, sir," whispered the housekeeper, as we climbed up the dark stairs. "My master will be angry if he discovers which bedroom you're sleeping in. For some reason, he doesn't want anyone to sleep there. I don't know why. There's strange people in this house, you know. Here's the room, sir." But I was too tired to listen. "Thank you, Zillah," I said, and taking the candle, I entered the room and closed the door. The only piece of furniture in the large, dusty bedroom was a bed, placed next to the window. There were heavy curtains, which could be pulled around it, to hide the sleeper from anyone else in the room. Looking inside the curtains, I saw a little shelf full of books just under the window. I put my candle down on the shelf and dropped thankfully onto the bed. I closed the curtains around the bed and felt safe from Heathcliff and everyone else at Wuthering Heights. I noticed that there were names written on the wall in childish handwriting. Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, and Catherine Linton. Then I fell asleep, but I was woken very suddenly by a smell of burning. My candle had fallen onto a Bible on the shelf and was burning it. When I opened the Bible to see if it was damaged, I found that wherever there was an empty page, or half a page, someone had written on it. And on the first page was written, "Catherine Earnshaw's Diary, 1776. Who was the girl who had slept in this bed, written her name on the wall, and then written her diary in the Bible 25 years ago? I read it with interest. "How I hate my brother Hindley," it began. "He is so cruel to poor Heathcliff. If only my father hadn't died. While he was alive, Heathcliff was like a brother to Hindley and me. But now Hindley and his wife Frances have inherited the house and the money, and they hate Heathcliff. That horrible old servant Joseph is always angry with Heathcliff and me because we don't pray or study the Bible. and when he tells his master, Hindley always punishes us. I can't stop crying. Poor Heathcliff. Hindley says he is wicked and can't play with me or eat with me any more. My eyes were beginning to close again, and I fell asleep. Never before had I passed such a terrible night, disturbed by the most frightening dreams. Suddenly, I was woken by a gentle knocking on the window. It must be the branch of a tree, I thought, and tried to sleep again. Outside, I could hear the wind driving the snow against the window. But I could not sleep. The knocking annoyed me so much that I tried to open the window. When it did not open, I broke the glass angrily and stretched out my hand towards the branch. But instead, my fingers closed around a small, ice-cold hand. It held my hand tightly, and a voice cried sadly, "Let me in! Let me in!" "Who are you?" I asked, trying to pull my hand away. "Catherine Linton," it replied. "I've come home. I lost my way." There seemed to be a child's face looking in at the window. Terror made me cruel. I rubbed the creature's tiny wrist against the broken glass so that blood poured down onto the bed. As soon as the cold fingers let go for a moment, I pulled my hand quickly back, put a pile of books in front of the broken window, and tried not to listen to the desperate cries outside. "Go away," I called. "I'll never let you in, not if you go on crying for 20 years. "It is almost 20 years, replied the sad little voice. "I've been out here in the dark for nearly 20 years. The hand started pushing through the window at the pile of books, and I knew it would find me and catch hold of me again. Unable to move, I stared in horror at the shape behind the glass and screamed. There were rapid footsteps outside my bedroom door, and then I saw the light of a candle in the room. "Is anyone here?" whispered Heathcliff. He could not see me behind the curtains, and clearly did not expect an answer. I knew I could not hide from him, so I opened the curtains wide. I was surprised by the effect of my action. Heathcliff dropped his candle and stood without moving, his face as white as the wall behind him. He did not seem to recognize me. "It's only your guest, Lockwood," I said. "I'm sorry. I must have had a bad dream and screamed in my sleep." "To the devil with you, Mr. Lockwood," growled my landlord. "Who allowed you to sleep in this room? Who was it?" "It was your housekeeper, Mr. Heathcliff," I said, quickly putting my clothes on. "And I'm angry with her myself. No one can sleep in a room full of ghosts." "What do you mean?" asked Heathcliff, looking suddenly very interested. "Ghosts, you say?" "That little girl, Catherine Linton, or Earnshaw, or whatever her name was, must have been wicked. She told me she had been a ghost for nearly 20 years. It was probably a punishment for her wickedness." "How dare you speak of her to me?" cried Heathcliff wildly. But as I described my dream, he became calmer and sat down on the bed, trembling as he tried to control his feelings. "Mr. Lockwood," he said finally, brushing a tear from his eye. "You can go into my bedroom to sleep for the rest of the night. I'll stay here for a while." "No more sleep for me tonight," I replied. "I'll wait in the kitchen until it's daylight, and then I'll leave. You needn't worry about my visiting you again, either. I've had enough company for a long time." But as I turned to go downstairs, my landlord, thinking he was alone, threw himself on the bed, pushed open the window, and called into the darkness. "Come in! Come in!" he cried, tears rolling down his face. "Catherine, do come! My darling, hear me this time!" But only the snow and wind blew into the room. How could my dream have produced such madness? I could not watch his suffering any more, and went downstairs. I waited in the kitchen until it was light enough outside for me to find my way through the deep snow back to Thrushcross Grange. The housekeeper there, Ellen Dean, rushed out to welcome me home. She thought I must have died in the previous night's snowstorm. With a warm fire and a hot meal, I began to recover from my unpleasant experiences. After my stay at Wuthering Heights, I thought I would never want to speak to any human being again. But by the end of the next day, I was beginning to feel lonely. I decided to ask Mrs. Dean to sit with me after supper. "How long have you lived in this house?" I asked her. 18 years, sir. I came here early in 1783, when my mistress was married, to look after her. And when she died, I stayed here as housekeeper." "Who was your mistress?" I asked. "Her name was Catherine Earnshaw," she replied. "Ah, my ghostly Catherine," I muttered quietly to myself. "She married Mr. Edgar Linton, a neighbour," added Mrs. Dean. "And they had a daughter, Cathy, who married Mr. Heathcliff's son." "Ah, so that must be the widow, young Mrs. Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights." "That's right, sir. Did you see her? I looked after her as a baby, you know. How is she? I do want to know." "She looked very well, and very beautiful, but I don't think she's happy." "Oh, poor thing. And what did you think of Mr. Heathcliff?" "He's a rough, hard man, Mrs. Dean. But I'm very interested in him. Tell me more about him." "Well, he's very rich, of course, and mean at the same time. He could live here at Thrushcross Grange, which is a finer house than Wuthering Heights, but he would rather receive rent than live comfortably. But I'll tell you the whole story of his life, as much as I know, that is, and then you can judge for yourself."
Chapter 3. Ellen Dean's Story. Catherine and Heathcliff as Children. 1770. When I was a child, I was always at Wuthering Heights, because my mother was a servant with the Earnshaw family. They are a very old family who've lived in that house for centuries, as you can see from their name on the stone over the front door. I grew up with Catherine and Hindley Earnshaw, and we three played together as children. One day, their father, Mr. Earnshaw, came back from a long journey. He had travelled 60 miles to Liverpool and back on business and was very tired. "Look what I've brought you," he told us all, unwrapping something he was holding carefully in his arms. Catherine and Hindley were expecting presents, and they rushed eagerly to see what it was. They were very disappointed to see only a dirty, black-haired gypsy child. "I found him all alone in the busy streets of Liverpool," Mr. Earnshaw explained to them, "and I couldn't leave him to die. He can sleep in your room." But Hindley and Catherine were angry because they had not received any presents and refused to let the strange child share their room. However, Mr. Earnshaw insisted, and little by little the boy became accepted by the family. He was called Heathcliff as a first and last name. No one ever discovered who his parents had been. Catherine and he became great friends, but Hindley hated him and was often cruel to him. Old Mr. Earnshaw was strangely fond of this gypsy child and frequently punished his son for behaving badly to Heathcliff. Hindley began to be jealous of his father's feelings for Heathcliff and saw them both as enemies. The situation could not last. As Mr. Earnshaw grew old and ill, Heathcliff became even more his favourite, and Hindley often quarrelled with his father. When Hindley was sent away to study, I hoped that we would have peace in the house. But then it was that old servant Joseph who caused trouble. He tried to persuade his master to be stricter with the children, and was always complaining that Heathcliff and Catherine did not spend enough time studying the Bible or attending church services. Catherine was a wild, wicked girl in those days. We had to watch her every moment of the day to stop her playing her tricks on us. She was proud and liked giving orders. But she had the prettiest face and the sweetest smile you've ever seen. I could forgive her anything when she came to say she was sorry. She was much too fond of Heathcliff, and the worst punishment we could invent was to keep her separate from him. Her father could no longer understand her or her behaviour, and Catherine did not realise that his illness made him less patient with her. At last, Mr. Earnshaw found peace. He died quietly in his chair by the fire one October evening in 1775. The night was wild and stormy, and we were all sitting together in the big kitchen. Joseph was reading his Bible at the table, while Catherine had her head on her father's knee. He was pleased to see her so gentle for once, and she was singing him to sleep. I was glad the old gentleman was sleeping so well, but when it was time to go to bed, Catherine put her arms round her father's neck to say good night, and immediately screamed, "Oh, he's dead, Heathcliff! He's dead!" Heathcliff and I started crying loudly and bitterly too. Joseph told me to fetch the doctor, so I ran to the village, although I knew it was too late. When I came back, I went to the children's room to see if they needed me, and I listened for a moment at their door. They were imagining the dead man in a beautiful, distant place, far from the troubles of this world. And as I listened, crying silently, I could not help wishing we were all there safe together.